This is Keys to the Shop, episode 90, Researching the Cafe with Dr. Jennifer Ferreira. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Keys to the Shop, where we give you insights, inspiration, and the tools to help you grow as a coffee service professional. Thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Chris DeFerio. I'm your host for the show. Today, we get the pleasure of chatting with Dr. Jennifer Ferreira, who is a researcher based out of Coventry, England, and her focus is on studying cafes, coffee shops, and their place in society, their impact on society, and this is just a great conversation. I think you're going to like it. First, we want to thank our sponsors here at Keys to the Shop, starting with Prima Coffee. So Prima Coffee is a specialty coffee equipment supplier, and they are based out of Louisville, Kentucky. And from the beginning of their company, they have set out to make the best coffee brewing equipment available to the general public. And their focus is on curating the best equipment for every need, from grinders to espresso machines, under-counter refrigeration, pretty much anything you can think of. They do a fantastic job of sourcing all the things they carry, and they're experts in it. They put a big emphasis on having the expertise to help their customers get the right gear to fit every situation. So whether you are thinking about opening a coffee bar and need to know some things about like what types of espresso machines and grinders you're going to need to do the best job possible in your shop, or you already own a shop and you want to get some new equipment or some upgrades, they definitely can help you out. Just go to prima-coffee.com, see what they have to offer, get in contact with them, tell them that Keys to the Shop sent you, and I know that they're going to be able to help you get what you need. They're fantastic to work with, and I can't recommend them enough. So again, go to prima-coffee.com. My thanks to Prima for your support of Keys to the Shop. I also want to thank our sponsor, Pacific Foods. They are the people behind the fantastic Pacific Barista Series line of non-dairy performance beverages, and those are designed specifically for baristas, professional baristas, and the standards for excellence that they demand, whether it's almond, soy, coconut, rice, or their new addition, oat milk. Its ability to take the heat from steaming, produce an unmatched silky texture, and keep the flavor balance focused on coffee makes it a perfect choice for your cafe's menu. Pacific supports the specialty coffee industry like no other. They have just been cheerleaders for baristas around the world in cafes, and it shows in the fact that they listen to and serve the needs of real specialty coffee professionals. So go to pacificfoods.com to learn more about the Barista Series line of non-dairy beverages and see how they can help elevate your cafe's menu and your non-dairy game. Now, Dr. Ferreira has a very robust background in academia. She has a master's in research methodology from the University of Liverpool, a PhD in economic geography from the University of Manchester. She's been a writer for the Royal Geographical Society and also a tutor with Villiers Park Educational Trust. And since 2014, she has been a researcher with Coventry University, and for the past year has been the senior researcher for coffee business intelligence. For the past solid 3 years, Dr. Ferreira has been making coffee shops in the cafe and coffee industry the focus of her expertise and research. And mainly it falls along the lines of exploring the growth and development of the coffee and cafe industry, the role and impact of cafes on economies and urban communities, the role of the third spaces in an urban community, and the coffee shop industry and sustainability. And we touch on a little bit of all of these things in the course of our conversation. Just really impressed by how prolific Dr. Ferreira is in not only what she produces in her research, but in her writings on her website, cafespaces.wordpress.com. So it was really a pleasure to be able to speak with her today a little bit about this place we call home, the cafe, what we do for a living. So let's get right to it. I'm excited to bring this conversation to you. So let's talk now with Dr. Jennifer Ferreira. Well, Dr. Ferreira, welcome to Keys to the Shop. So glad to have you on the show.
Thank you for the invitation. It's been great to talk to you.
I've been a big fan of your work ever since discovering it on your Twitter feed and looking into the research that you've been undertaking in cafes and your work. You're a researcher at the Center for Business in Society in Coventry, England. I'm curious, how did you get interested in exploring coffee academically, and how does that fit into the work that you do at the Center for Business in Society?
It's been a bit of a long journey, really. I mean, I've had an interest in the coffee industry for a long time, back since I was a geography teacher sort of over a decade ago. The coffee industry is one that's truly global, and, I've had an interest in how the coffee system works and the different roles of different countries in it. But it's only really the coffee shop industry side of the things has been something that's really I've developed an interest in since I was a student, spending time in coffee shops, seeing sort of, coffee shop chains expand, seeing the different types of coffee shops, developing, and the rise of specialty coffee. And at the time my research was based around employment systems in different countries, and I was traveling around and doing all my interviews and my research, and I ended up spending a lot of time in coffee shops. And it's really then I started to think about the diversity of what was going on in the coffee industry, and it's kind of gone from there. I've moved on with my research. And I went on a walking tour in Seattle, and it was at that point really for me that I recognised the real diversity in coffee shops and the coffee industry and what was going on there. And so when an opportunity for doing some research around cafes and coffee shops came about, I applied for some funding and was successful. It gave me an opportunity to start looking at this from an academic perspective, having time to look at the literature, but also go and do research, talking to cafe owners, managers, baristas, coffee consumers, and it really started off as a personal interest, became then kind of a side arm to my research, and now has become my kind of main research area.
Oh, interesting. So the scope of your research it is mainly focused around the UK.
To start with, that was the plan, because it was just a small research project that I started with, looking at how coffee shops could be community hubs in the UK, and at the time a few UK cities, but really there's been so much development in the coffee shop industry sort of globally that it's expanded into all sorts of different countries that I've started to write about, and one of my more research projects has direct comparisons with what's going on in Germany as well.
Oh, great. And so the cafe in particular is the last link in the value chain, sort of caught your eye as the main place where kind of everything converges, and it has this impact on society, sort of that third place you're talking about.
Yeah.
So there's a real depth of information you can study within the shop. What themes have emerged as you study and observe the cafe culture and society and its growth?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of different themes that have come out of looking at the different nature of cafe cultures around the globe. And then, lots of different countries have really rich coffee or tea drinking cultures, some of which go back centuries. And so it's really interesting to see how these change over time, how different countries' cultures begin to influence each other. I've just written a paper on the changing coffee shop culture in China, for example, which, traditionally is more associated with drinking tea, but it's got a rising coffee shop industry and coffee culture, and even a growing reputation for growing coffee as well. And then another key thing really is the growth of specialty coffee culture. And that's been one of the key things that's been developing over sort of the last decade in the things I've been looking at. Back when I started to look at the coffee industry, the concept of the third wave was not as well known as it is now, and there just weren't as many specialty coffee shops. So we've seen a really big shifting landscape for the coffee shops themselves, which has obviously a big impact on the kind of roles they can play in society. Obviously they are commercial spaces, but one of the things I've been trying to look at is the cafe coffee shop as a social space, from being places to meet friends, to go on a date, to take the family, but also around cafes as spaces of work and the various ways that cafes and consumers manage this. Some coffee shops encourage the use of their place for work, and others not so much. And particularly with the rise of the gig economy, it's been really interesting to see how coffee shops have been used as kind of workspaces as well.
Oh, I concur with that. I'd say 50% or more of the people I see in the cafe where I work are taking meetings, running their businesses from tabletops and getting refills of coffee. It's probably similar to the way it's always been, just it's a lot more obvious with larger MacBooks and things like that.
Yeah, and I think in that sense, it's kind of made the idea of cafes as the third place kind of shift a bit, because the third place is supposed to be separate from home and work, where really the coffee shop these days for a lot of people is a space of work, whether they're having a meeting or whether they're actually using it as an office, or for those kind of things.
Well, that's interesting. It seems somewhat of a shame also in that maybe if we're not able to cut ourselves off from work, and I know this is definitely a little off topic, as maybe to do with balance of work and home and things like that, but we certainly have to have some kind of an off switch, and a cafe is usually a space where people like to do that, but having those business meetings and things like that sort of, it seems like it might ruin it, and also kind of promote a lot more of a transactional reality for the cafe.
I think definitely for some people and for some places, but I think that kind of raises the point about there are lots of different types of cafes and people use them in different ways at different times. So, there are, if you look in the City of London or any city centre in the middle of the day, the kinds of things going on in the cafe are much more going to be more of the transactional type, the business meetings, those kind of things. But if you visit them towards the end of the day, maybe, towards the end of work or at the weekend, they're kind of very different places. So I think that's another thing where coffee shops are really interesting, is that over the space of the day or over the space of a week, they can be very different places. And that can make them quite interesting too, to see that change.
Yeah, that seems like they are simply the manifestation of the needs of a society.
Definitely, and depending on where they're located, will have a big impact as well. And that's been one of the things I've looked at a lot, is that, the location of the coffee shop affects the consumer base, therefore it can affect the character of the coffee shop itself, and what it tries to do and the kind of impact it tries to have. If you've got a coffee shop that's near a train station, it's going to have a very different kind of community impact to one that's in a suburban area that's designed to bring in families. It'd be very different.
Well, let's dive into that a little bit, because one of the branches of your studies into cafes in their role in society is the economic impact that they have. They have this ripple effect on society. So what have you seen that are various ways cafes can have an economic impact, especially in cities and urban environments?
Sure. So there was a piece of research in the UK that was done a couple of years ago that suggested that a coffee shop had the potential to increase the local economy by about 3 to 5%, based on the fact that people would come to the coffee shop and then go and spend money in the sort of the local area, other shops, other businesses, that kind of thing. And the work I've done kind of supports that, in the idea that coffee shops and cafes are increasingly still providing a place for people to go in city centres and to visit, against the backdrop of shopping malls and online shopping, where people don't necessarily need to go into the high street. So coffee shops are still kind of providing that reason for people to go down, go into city centres and spend money, and they are likely to spend money in other businesses too. But I think another impact, particularly the specialty coffee shops have been having, is about the impact in developing other businesses, so things like coffee roasters. So the rise in people drinking more coffee and visiting more coffee shops has meant other kind of businesses have been developing, lots of micro roasteries, or coffee shops expanding into roasteries, that kind of thing. And then there's sort of broader economic impacts in terms of like creating jobs. So we've had, massive rise in the number of coffee shops has created a lot of job positions for lots of people in cities. And they're kind of some of the key impacts I've seen.
Is this all positive, that the impact of coffee shops on a society? What have you seen that's maybe not so much on the bright side?
I mean, one of the things that coffee shops often get talked about a lot in the same conversation is gentrification. Mm-hmm. And in terms of negative impacts, it is true that in a lot of the areas that become more gentrified and more economic developed in that way, you do tend to find sort of higher concentrations of coffee shops. But it's not an issue that's been looked into in a lot of depth academically yet. People are starting to look at this. And there was a really interesting article in Barista Magazine recently that considered why there's this association between coffee shops and gentrification. And it highlights some of the ways that coffee shops end up appearing in gentrified areas, but they're not necessarily driving the process, that they're just responding to the needs of the people that have ended up being there. So a lot of things you read about coffee shops and gentrification, you need to think about what's driving the process. Often coffee shops end up in a particular area, not because they're driving gentrification, but because they're responding to the process that's there. But again, this is something that that needs a lot more research in terms of looking at what's happening around coffee shops and local communities in these particular types of areas.
So the cafe is a space for a neighborhood, or a space where people can meet friends, and it's a part of a culture of a neighborhood. Seems to be at the heart of that issue in particular. It can either enrich the neighborhood and the area, or it could be an opportunistic grab for something that is available business-wise, and maybe not add as much as another shop that maybe has a little bit deeper roots in a society and it manifests itself in a more negative way.
Sure, and it depends a lot. And the people who run these cafes and what they want to do can have a real big impact on how they manage that process and how much they involve the local community or how much they end up excluding them. So how they manage their cafe can have a big impact on that.
So we as a cafe industry, we share our photos online. We follow each other on social media. We spur one another on to different feats of business. And the image of a cafe right now has I would say the third wave is somewhat of a minimalistic landscape interior-wise, as an example of how, or the EK43 grinder, for example, something that can kind of make its way through the internet and manifest itself all over the world. Our influence on one another as professionals, peer-to-peer, have you seen that be somewhat of a driver, kind of like a momentum behind the rise of specialty coffee in a city that's different than maybe the second wave was, when there wasn't as much connectivity?
I certainly think the coffee communities that developed in lots of different cities is really has been driving the growth of particularly specialty coffee, the growth of coffee shops in lots of different cities. I mean, certainly in London and some of the other cities that I've looked at, there's a strong coffee community where baristas train in particular coffee shops, and then they end up setting up their own businesses, and lots of people all know each other within these different cities, and that drives the kind of strong culture that's been developing in there. So I think there's a community element to the actual coffee shop industry in terms of who works in it as well, in terms of, there's all the coffee competitions, and increasingly there's coffee festivals where, all these people can meet and network and develop the industry even further. So I think that's something that's happening quite a bit too in lots of different cities.
Well, it's really interesting to hear just about the growth of coffee shops and the way we sort of multiply and affect our environment. And it's not without impact, obviously. One of the things that I know that James Hoffman had cited your research in one of his recent videos, if I'm not mistaken, about the to-go cups, for example, because I know in the UK that there was a latte levy, I believe is what it was called.
Yeah, it was. They proposed a latte levy in a report, but the government have decided that they won't implement that. They feel the industry is doing enough as it is. But yeah, the latte levy was an idea that was proposed. So they have a tax of about 25 pence per drink, but that wasn't seen to be something that the government wanted to implement.
They decided it wasn't going to be that helpful. The cafe obviously produces a ton of waste, and as far as carbon footprints and what we do with the environment, the coffee shop is the number one driver of this. And so as much as we like to be centers for society to have a third space, we need to take care of our neighborhoods. And I wonder, sustaining that business is where we tend to focus. Like, we want to make more money. We need to get more people in the door. We need more to-go cups. I mean, what areas of sustainability can we look at now that would have a wide-scale impact? And obviously the to-go cups are a huge part of this, but there's probably other ways that we're inadvertently damaging our surroundings.
Sure. I mean, the to-go cups has been one of the issues that's been in the media a lot, in terms of, there's millions and billions in each country being produced, or several countries being produced each year. But packaging more generally, I think, is something that a lot of cafes can look at, consider about switching the products they use or minimizing the amount of packaging. Because part of the reason the UK government decided they didn't want to implement the latte levy was they felt that the broader issue of packaging needed work rather than just focusing on the disposable cups themselves. But then there's things that you can look at, what you can do with coffee grounds, because obviously, cafes go through tons of coffee and produce all these coffee grounds, and actually there's lots of things that can be done with those. So whether you provide coffee grounds free to the consumers, that they can use it in their garden, that kind of thing, or donate it to local food growing projects. It's really good for using compost, that kind of thing. But increasingly, we're seeing lots of innovation around this area. I mean, there's a company in the UK that's using coffee grounds to create fuel. So there's those kind of more innovative things that, the broader industry can think about doing, looking at other waste products, not just the packaging. And then it's thinking about how to reduce energy consumption more generally, I would think. Can you switch to a type of renewable energy? Can you think about the way your building's designed to kind of, maximize light so you don't need to use as much heating, things like that. And I mean, there's all sorts of things that can be done. I mean, thinking more with a kind of circular economy head on, thinking about how you can use any kind of waste materials or repurpose things, thinking about all the different elements of the industry, not just the packaging. Can you source food locally? Obviously, that's not always an option for a coffee shop, depending on, where you're located, the kind of foods that are produced locally, the kind of, budgets you're working on, but it's something to consider as well.
So just taking everything, kind of putting it under a microscope and looking at its broad scale.
Sure, looking at all the different elements to the business and where can waste products be reused or donated elsewhere so they can have an impact in perhaps used for a different product, not necessarily in the coffee industry, but lots of there's been a few examples where coffee grounds have been used in other products as well, sort of cosmetic products, all those kind of things. So thinking about more broadly where things can be reused.
Do you feel that when you're doing that kind of investigation and the due diligence into being more ecologically responsible, so to speak, that it might slow the growth of cafes? Because it seems to me that a lot of the growth of cafes have been because there's been a turnkey element to franchises or chains, or just the ease of which you can just buy a machine, buy a grinder, don't worry about it, and then start a coffee company.
It's really difficult. I mean, increasingly consumers seem to want to have businesses to have more an environmental awareness, and for some businesses, that's why they're starting to consider issues around environmental sustainability, because they want to have a sustainability policy and they want to demonstrate to their consumers that they're trying to minimize their impact on the environment. But then for a lot of independent businesses, it's finding the time to think about all these issues and to make the kind of changes that you need to can be challenging for a small business where margins are pretty tight. And it's all very well saying, switch to local producers or try and, do things with your waste. But in terms of practicality, and, when I've talked to various managers, it's like, we'd love to do various things, but, I'm working 7 days a week. I'd like the time to sit down and think about these things, but I'm just managing the coffee shop as it is. And that's why it's easier if you're just setting up a business, just to use the things that you've seen other businesses do and just try and manage that on a day-to-day basis. And they don't necessarily have the time to think about the broader, longer-term environmental impact, even if, their intentions are good and they'd like to.
So then it becomes a problem for people who produce the things that produce the waste to answer for people who don't have time to necessarily research it as much.
Ideally, I mean, there's definitely, if companies can start, advertising the fact that, use my type of packaging, it's compostable or decomposable, and it can, and it will provide that kind of environmental element your business needs, perhaps, and to try and put that in front of various cafes and coffee shops to make them aware of it and to demonstrate how it might help their business.
One thing about sustainability and knowing that a producer of a coffee to-go cup or a coffee bag wants to be on trend, and certainly sustainability is a buzzword that gets thrown around a lot, especially in specialty coffee. We have to be able to know that they're actually telling the truth about that. Sure. That recycling was one of the big aha moments covered in some of your work, and people were a little bit miffed that they weren't actually recycling the cups that they thought they were recycling.
Yeah, exactly. So it's making people aware of the systems and how they work and how they need to interact with them to actually, make sure their cup gets to the right place to be recycled. Or, for example, there are various compostable cups and packaging available, but a lot of those are can only be composted in an industrial facility. You can't necessarily just put them in your garden composting system and they'll decompose. And so there's still a lot of misconceptions about how the systems work. And I think that would be one of the key things moving forward in terms of, raising people's awareness of how things work and how they can have an impact with their own behaviors based on how the systems work.
So there's this dual responsibility to sort of demand as an owner to be aware, and then demand from some of the suppliers transparency. Just like we do with coffee, we want transparency. Yep. We want the same thing with cups and paper and things like that.
Yeah, and however the recycling systems and waste disposal systems work in different countries in terms of what facilities are available and how they work.
It seems to me like in this process, there is a question that keeps popping up in my mind where more and more we want to grow and we want to saturate a market, and even the more saturated markets, like Portland, Oregon, for example, people are still opening roasteries and people are still opening coffee shops. Is more always better when it comes to cafes? What kind of an effect does this churn of cafes coming and going and saturating a market have? Is more always better?
Well, there's been lots of discussion recently in the UK anyway about whether we've reached peak coffee shop. Can the high streets and city centres really sustain anymore? In terms of we can't really. There's only so many people that we can attract to bring into the city centres. Is having just lots of coffee shops in an area kind of removing the character of a particular place. Some city centres would in the past may have had a real mix of the types of shops and things that were there, and now it might be a string of coffee shops. So isn't necessarily better, but I think there's still a lot of diversity between coffee shops, and some will have roasteries attached to them, some won't, and some of them try to have particular themes around what they're trying to do, and by having that variation, there's still room for more. But in some places there's definitely question about whether there's too many coffee shops or at least enough for the local population, and I think that's something you'll see increasingly as they continue to expand, whether they can sustain that kind of growth in different areas.
It would seem that a return to a sustainable kind of long-term business that sticks around and is really a part of the neighborhood in the third place would cut down on a lot of the worry about sustainability, in that more people may drink coffee inside and have a more conscientious view because there's more time to sort of become aware of your surroundings and less of a in and out and forget about it mentality.
Ideally, but again, that depends a lot on the type of cafe and coffee shop you're working in. Mm-hmm. If you're in a small coffee shop that's mainly with the takeaway customer base, you're never going to have that kind of third space that you perhaps would like to have. If you don't have a large space where you can have lots of tables and people coming in and spending time, you can't create that kind of vibe.
Yeah, you can do your part too, though, by having those reusable cups. I know a lot of us do reusable thermoses and cups with a discount. That probably helps as well.
Definitely. There's definitely things like that can have an impact on how consumers view your business in sustainability terms and having an impact. Definitely the reusable cups and having that incentive there certainly seem to have had an impact for a lot of businesses.
So in the research, what have been some promising signs you've seen in cafes that shows that we're somewhat on the right track? I would say for both this topic of sustainability and also having a positive impact both economically and sociologically on our neighborhoods.
So there's the issue around the to-go cups. Lots of companies have had incentives for using them in place for years, and it's only really because of the issues been raised in the media, that more people are recognizing that actually, okay, if I take a reusable cup, I can get a discount. And a lot of companies have been trying to promote what they're doing with that, trying to make sure there's recycling facilities, that kind of thing. So on the sustainability side, lots of businesses are trying to make an effort there. But then I think, lots of different cafes and coffee shops do more than just provide, food and drink. Lots of them will have, display local artwork, helping local artists display their work, having, music events, having coffee cuppings and things like that, in terms of, displaying local roasteries and getting people together to really show off what specialty coffee can do in the area. And lots of different community activities. I mean, one of the main things for the project I started with was about looking at how coffee shops can be community hubs. And I think there's lots of different things that coffee shops can do in terms of bringing people together if they want to be that kind of third space, whether it's providing, a space in the coffee shop for certain groups of people to get together, providing places where students can work together, for example, or reading groups, or all sorts of different kind of social activities that can take place in a coffee shop. And there's been loads of different examples I found of places doing that. And I think that can have a really positive impact on the community if the business chooses to kind of, encourage that kind of activity taking place, whether it's, playing board games or providing spaces for people to get together in the way they design their coffee shop, for example.
I love it. Yeah, that sounds fantastic. I would love more spaces like that in the neighborhood for sure. And, not many of us have the opportunity. I would say very few of us have the opportunity to just focus in and study cafes the way you do. And from what you've discovered over this period of time, how long has it been now since you've been really just drilling down on this particular subject?
2015 is when I started looking at the community side of coffee shops. So it's the last sort of 2-3 years where I've really had a lot more time to really look into the industry, talk to people, look at what's been going on. And then as I mentioned before, the project's kind of evolved into the wider coffee shop industry and issues of sustainability and things like that. So it's really been over the last sort of 3 years where I've had a lot more time to look at these issues.
So certainly, maybe you could guess my next question, and it has to do with predictions. What kind of future do you foresee, near future, for cafes? What kind of future are we in for, based on what you've studied and seen so far and the way we've grown, the way we are now?
I think in a lot of cities and a lot of countries, you'll continue to see growth in the coffee shop industry, but not necessarily concentrated in the city centres that we've seen in previous years. So places London, Manchester, and the big cities in the US have probably got really high concentrations of coffee shops. But the more suburban areas, the smaller cities, the smaller towns, they don't necessarily have that concentration yet. Certainly not specialty coffee. Coventry, for example, until recently hasn't had many specialty coffee places, but that's starting to develop. And I think over the next few years, you'll see more specialty coffee cafes opening in a broader range of areas rather than just concentrating in sort of city centres and that kind of thing. I think you'll see growth of the coffee shop industry perhaps in different countries that you may not have considered in the past, or the coffee shop cultures will continue to change. As I mentioned before, in China, the coffee shop culture is growing a lot, and I think you'll see that will continue. And probably there'll be shifts in coffee producer countries as well, as they start to develop their specialty coffee shop industries too.
Excellent. Sounds awesome. What would make you the happiest when people read your research and start to just kind of form their thinking anew around cafes? Just what impact on the way people think and act around the world of cafes would make you the happiest?
It would make me happy if coffee shops were used as these kind of community hubs that I'd like to think that they all were. I mean, obviously, one of the things that I've found a lot of my research is that there's a huge diversity of coffee shops and cafes, and not all of them are used as community hubs. But I think there's a potential for cafes really to bring people together if they're managed in the right way, if they're inclusive of the people, their local communities. And I think if people consider how they run their cafes and how they try to include their local communities, they could be the third places that the concept really wanted them to be in the first place.
I'm right there with you. I agree. I really have enjoyed this conversation, and I appreciate you taking the time to just chat with us about your research and open our eyes to some of the things that we can do to be more responsible in the footprint that we leave when we're just operating our coffee shops. How can we stay in touch with you and the work that you're undertaking in studying cafes?
So I have a research blog called Cafe Spaces, and that's just cafespaces.wordpress.com. And so I have updates based on my research projects there, but also about things I'm reading around the coffee industry and sort of ideas about what's going on. You can read about all those things there. And you can follow me on Twitter as well. I try and tweet out sort of various bits and pieces that I'm doing around the work there. And my Twitter handle is at Jenny Wren Watts. So they're the two main places where you can get the most up-to-date information on what's happening with my research there.
Excellent. Well, Dr. Ferreira, thank you so much again for joining us on the show. It was a pleasure.
Oh, thank you for the invitation. It's been great. Thank you.
So one of the main things that I took away from this conversation with Dr. Ferreira was the idea that it really is all of our responsibilities to do our due diligence and research the cafe in our own way. And whether that means you are looking at Dr. Ferreira's website and work, which you absolutely should, at cafespaces.wordpress.com, and staying up to date with the latest articles and research on what's going on in the industry, but also investigating on a local level what is happening in your own community. What are the systems that your cafe participates in, and how can you have a positive impact on those systems, be they social systems or economic or ecological? You have the ability to create change simply by participating in the conversation and accumulating information. I would say that what Dr. Ferreira is doing on a broad scale is going to make a huge impact, and has already made a big impact on the coffee industry. And we have the power to do the same thing, especially in our local sphere. I love the portion of this where we talked about how we need to investigate the systems that we rely upon. We can just research the way that our recycling systems work in a city to make sure that we're doing the right things. Maybe we've thought for a long time that we're doing something environmentally responsible, and in fact, it's actually missing the mark a little bit. We can dig to find out. Just like we can demand transparency about our coffee, we can demand the same thing from those who are providing us with paper cups and packaging and other things like that. So I thought that was really great. And also, I do resonate with the idea at the end where Dr. Ferreira was talking about it would be great to have the community hub aspect of coffee bars just become even more popular and grow and grow. I personally feel like that is the future for coffee bars, because people long for that sort of deep personal contact with other people. I would love to see that happen. And so I really did resonate with that portion of the conversation. I hope that this has been a good episode for you to view your cafe and other cafes in a different light. And again, to become your own researcher and let Dr. Ferreira's work inspire you. Go to cafespaces.wordpress.com. Get out and visit her on Twitter. We'll link to those on the show notes here on iTunes. And my thanks to Dr. Ferreira for coming on the show and sharing a little bit about her research, her opinions, and some predictions of the future of cafes. It was really fun. So thank you, Dr. Ferreira, for being an inspiration to us. Now, if you want the show notes for this episode, you can go to keystotheshop.com, and on the sidebar, there is a little place for you to put your email. Once you do that, you will be signed up to receive a weekly email that has the show notes in it. And the show notes are simply a collection of the main points from each episode and also all of the links mentioned in those episodes. So in this case, we'll have links to Dr. Ferreira's work, as well as some other referenced material that we talked about in this conversation, along with the main points that she was making on coffee bars as a community hub and our impact on the economy, etc. A really handy guide, as well as some news about Keys to the Shop and what we're up to at the podcast, as well as the consulting arm of Keys to the Shop. So again, you can go to keystotheshop.com, put your email in, and then you're signed up. So speaking of Keys to the Shop news, Coffee Fest is coming up shortly in Denver, Colorado, and I will be there as a latte art judge and head judge for latte art competition with Coffee Fest, as well as I have a few teachings, a few lectures that I'm giving on things like the meaning of money in the cafe, talking about management, talking about 5 keys to a successful coffee shop. Just a good mix of subjects, and I'm really excited to present those things. It went really well in Baltimore, and I got to meet a bunch of you there, which was exciting. So if you're in the Denver area and you love coffee and want to learn more about coffee and coffee shops and be around people who are into the same thing, Coffee Fest is perfect to go to. I've been going to Coffee Fest and operating as an instructor, judge, or teacher in some capacity for a better part of 15 years, and it is a great trade show, especially for coffee shop retailers. Just go to coffeefest.com, click on the Denver show, and look through all of the different lectures and workshops and trainings and events and vendors. There's something for everybody, so I hope to see you there. If you are going to Denver, please do say hello. I would love to meet you and hear about what you got going on in the coffee world. And yeah, so coffeefest.com. I hope to see you there in Denver. And with that, it is the end of our show. This has been a really great one. I again encourage you to go to cafespaces.wordpress.com, research more of Dr. Ferreira's research, and let this conversation and Dr. Ferreira's work impact the way you impact your society, your neighborhood. And we all want to have a positive impact. And this, I think, has really been helpful to that end. So again, thank you for joining me on the show. And I truly do hope that this episode has given you, say it with me, keys to the shop.